When entitlement grips a charging cable and calls it destiny, what happens when the current answers back? And who pays the price when illusion collides with truth? Even before the first spark, the evening hum of the parking lot vibrated with the illusion of order. The mall's light spread a sterile glow across the rows of cars, and the Tesla's charge port pulsed a soft, patient blue as if breathing. He had arrived early, logged into the app, clipped the cable into place, and settled into the ritual of waiting that defines modern travel. Waiting is a kind of faith, isn't it? On screen, illusion. That was when she appeared, a sharp silhouette cutting through fluorescent reflection, moving with the brisk certainty of someone who has decided that rules are for other people. She scanned the charges the way a hawk scans a field, not for permission but for possession. What is possession if not a story we tell about territory, time, and what we think we deserve? She didn't ask, she announced, her voice already preloaded with defense, a verdict disguised as a greeting. He answered plainly that he'd been here, that the meter was running, that the cable in his hand meant what cables mean, a connection earned. She looked at the blue light like it had betrayed her, and maybe, in some private ledger, it had. We are all accountants of grievance when scarcity enters the room. Scarcity of sockets, scarcity of patience, scarcity of humility. Her fingers landed on the connector with the casual intimacy of theft, as if taking back a thing the world owed her. Do our hands know right from wrong before our mouths do? He stepped closer, not aggressive, not timid, but with the quiet authority of someone who recognizes that letting go now would be a rehearsal for letting go of everything later. Words rose like fog between them, obscuring shapes, cooling the air, soaking into cotton and plastic and pride. On screen, truth. She said the charger was public, which is to say she said the world was hers if she wanted it badly enough. He said the charger was occupied, which is to say he said boundaries exist even when we pretend not to see them. Between those two sentences lay the narrow bridge everyone crosses every day, the bridge between need and narrative. Maybe she was late for a dinner or a date or a life she feared was slipping, and maybe that fear needed a villain to point at. Villains are convenient, and so we manufacture them from strangers. He did not want to play the part, but the script had already started writing itself in her tone. When she tugged, and the connector stiffened in its lock, the moment hardened like cooling glass. Isn't it strange how a small resistance, a simple engineer click, can expose the physics of entitlement? She jerked harder, and the cable bowed like a question mark held too long. His hand lifted in a pacifying arc, palm open, an invitation to breathe, to step back, to remember the commons we supposedly share. But breath is the first thing we abandon when ego floods a room. Her phone was already recording, lens wide, algorithm hungry, because if you can't win the moment, you can sometimes win the narrative. He felt the old animal heat of being witnessed against his will. Who were they performing for, the two of them, if not the invisible jury we call the internet? An audience is a kind of God, demanding sacrifice and rewarding spectacle. He repeated that he would unplug in 5 minutes, and she repeated that 5 minutes is forever when you've decided not to wait. She planted her feet. He steadied his voice, and the cable became a rope in a tug-of-war no one could win. The charger hummed, indifferent, a machine married to rules that do not bend for feelings. On screen, consequence. The stillness between pulses grew heavy, an air before thunder, the prelude that tells us even electricity has a temperament. How thin is the membrane between a normal evening and a headline? As she twisted the connector again, more forceful now, the setup for everything that would follow locked into place like a circuit finding its path. The parking lot seemed to tilt toward them as if gravity itself picked a side, drawing curious eyes and camera lenses as the volume of their standoff grew by ounces rather than decibels. A couple paused beside a stack of shopping carts, whispering the shorthand of strangers who think they already know the plot. Across the aisle, a teenager lifted his phone like a lighter at a concert, hungry for the chorus. Is attention a fuel or poison? She tightened her grip on the connector, like a claimant on a deed, staking out a future by seizing the present. He kept his voice level, a metronome in a storm, repeating that 5 minutes would turn a red battery icon into a livable margin. 5 minutes, she echoed, like a prosecutor tasting a weakness, as if time itself were an insult when it refused to bow. The blue pulse on the Tesla blinked its quiet syllables. Lock engaged, current flowing, protocol intact. She leaned in and said there were rules. And he nodded and said there were rules. And somehow those identical words meant opposite things. On screen, boundary. Someone suggested they call security. But security never arrives when pride thinks it can do the job faster. He opened the app, thumb pausing, considering a remote stop that felt like capitulation to a story he did not accept. What do we owe a stranger when our own plans sit ticking like a bomb in our pocket? She announced that the charger was public, her voice scaling a ridge of syllables and planting a flag, while the sign behind her outlined courteous usage with the meekness of good intentions. He imagined the invisible grid beneath their feet, copper veins and substations, and rules written by engineers for the safety of people who rarely read them. Safety is boring until it's broken, and then it becomes scripture. She gave the connector another wrench, and the cable shuddered like a leash on a dog that refuses to heel. He stepped closer, palm still open, words still slow, asking her to let the cycle finish, and promising to move the moment it clicked. She said she had waited enough today, for checkout lines and traffic and apologies that never arrived, and maybe the connector was the first thing that looked like obedience. The teenager shifted for a better angle, reframing strangers into content, while the couple near the carts prepared their comments in silence. Who are we when we fear being small, and what do we grab when our reflection feels like it is shrinking? The air tastes of ozone and hot asphalt, a recipe for impatience, while the mall music leaked from a doorway like advice no one asked for. He thought of his father teaching him to share a baseball diamond. The chalk line sacred, the turns taken, the rules agreed before the first pitch. She thought of bills and balance and days that feel like a cue you cannot skip without disappearing altogether. On screen, escalation. He told her the lock would release when the car decided it was safe, and she told him she was done letting machines decide her life. We build tools to tame the wild, then grow feral when they tell us no. The cable groaned against its engineered tolerance, a sound like a confession, as if metal could admit it was designed to withstand people like them. He noticed his hands wanting to defend the port as if it were a throat, and he despised that instinct even as he honored it. She noticed a tiny smudge of her reflection in the glossy paint and wondered, in a flash she would not recall later, who she had become to be here like this. A car door slammed somewhere, the percussive punctuation that follows unsaid sentences. He offered again to stop the session, and the offer tasted like surrender to him and salvation to her, which is why neither of them could accept it at the same time. On screen, witness. A breeze curled through the aisle and set the cable swaying, a pendulum counting down to an event no one would fully understand. He imagined headlines and tried to steer away from them with one careful nod, but the road under their feet had narrowed to a two-lane bridge without railings. She imagined vindication and heard, faintly, the applause of the jury she'd summoned from the cloud. And applause is a tricky sound to resist. Isn't every conflict just two biographies colliding in a place neither book planned to visit? The blue pulse steadied, the hum rose, and the smell of heat grew slightly sweeter, like candy held too long in a pocket. On screen, fracture, and when her knuckles whitened once more and his name formed on his tongue like a plea, the circuit of escalation closed, humming with consequence that had not yet chosen its outlet. She leaned for the connector again, a motion everyone read as greed, but her eyes weren't on the cable so much as on a hairline soot mark that had not been there a minute ago, a bruise on plastic that only shows up right before the skin splits. On screen, illusion. She said stop, not like a command but like a reflex, and he heard it as more theater because Power, once narrated, refuses to change genre. What does it take for a warning to be believed when it comes from a mouth we've already cast as a villain? He thumbed the app to pause, a half-second late, the hum climbing a fraction higher, the scent of caramelized insulation sweetening into a quiet alarm. She reached not to steal but to save, the way you smack a stranger's hand away from a stove, because heat forgets to introduce itself. On screen, reversal. Back off, he said, and she said it's cracked, and the crowd heard two different movies dubbed over the same scene. He saw the teenager's lens widen and felt pride stand up inside him like a bodyguard. She saw the tiny crescent of melted plastic and felt training rise through her like a siren. What if the line between entitlement and intervention is thinner than a cable sheath, She grabbed the connector sleeve with her sleeve wrapped around her hand, insulating instinct meeting engineered failure, and in the same instant he tapped stop charging, which is to say he tried to end the story by pressing a word. Electricity obeys physics before it obeys software. On screen, spark, the arc popped. White, petulant, decisive, and it chose him. A lick of light that snapped from metal to skin, a punctuation mark that burns its lesson into flesh. He stumbled back with a sound he had never made before. Not pain exactly, not fear exactly, but a confession that bodies make when they meet the truth too fast. She caught his shoulder, guiding him to the concrete as if lowering a patient from a standing faint, voice dropping into the cadence of competence. "Talk to me. Follow my voice. Look at my fingers," she said, counting out seconds that turned into a rope they could both hold. On screen, witness becomes medic. The crowd inhaled like a choir that forgot the lyrics, and the teenager's phone lowered without permission from its owner. Isn't it strange how quickly spectacle surrenders when responsibility walks in? She checked for entry and exit, for burns small as coins, for a rhythm under his wrist that told the story the eyes couldn't yet. He stared at the blue pulse, now dark, now nothing, and felt a different kind of current begin. Gratitude, unwelcome and undeniable. "Why do you know exactly what to do?" he asked, the words carrying ashen awe. "Because last week it was my partner," she said, and the word partner hung there, unlabeled, suggesting ambulance lights, long nights, and a life measured in compressions per minute. On screen, truth. She barked for someone to call 911, but her voice was not a bark, so much as a bridge, carrying terror to a place where it can be used. He felt shame arriving with the sirens, not for the charge he needed, but for the charge he had read into her, a misfire of judgment that had been warming all evening. What if the villain we needed to film was an assumption? The couple near the cart stepped forward with water they forgot not to offer, and she refused it gently, explaining water and electricity the way you explain storms to children. He tried to sit, and she kept him down, an uncompromising gentleness that felt like forgiveness's little sister. On screen, contingency. Security came at last, all belts and radios, and found the situation already in the hands of someone whose authority was not a badge, but a practiced calm. He watched her direct them, watched her unhook the narrators in the crowd from their roles, watched her reset the scene from conflict to care. Is there a nobler theft than stealing a moment back from the algorithm? The paramedics arrived, and she handed them off with notes spoken in the shorthand of professionals, then followed into the ambulance not because she had to, but because leaving would have felt like abandoning a sentence before the verb. In the pitch light of the ER bay, he saw the smudge on her sleeve where the plastic had kissed fabric, a faint hieroglyph of intention. She stood by his bed through the beeps and the questions, answering some for him when the pride in his throat made speaking expensive. On screen, repentance. He apologized without decoration, the kind you say when your story has been peeled back to wire, and you realize how often we confuse tone for truth. She shrugged the apology into the room like a coat hung on a hook, not dismissing it, not wearing it, just letting it be ready when needed. "Why were you so certain?" he asked, and the ER smell made everything feel like confession. "Because it's my job to be certain when I see smoke that hasn't learned how to be flame," she said, and then softer. "And because people film me when I'm loud and ignore me when I'm right." On screen, bias. In the end, the report would read, arc flash, minor burn, observation recommended, and no one would file the addendum about narratives and how they hum before they snap. But he would remember that the shock that mattered most wasn't the one that bit his skin. It was a jolt of seeing a stranger become a savior the moment the current exposed a circuit in his own certainty. Morning arrived like a reset button no one trusts, all pale light and the antiseptic hush of a hospital that has already forgiven the night. He was clear with instructions and cautions that sounded like wisdom disguised as bullet points, a list of ways to be smaller around power. She stood at the doorway with a coffee she didn't drink and a patience that looked to him like courage without the costume. On screen, forgiveness. He thanked her again, and the word felt too thin for the weight it had to carry, a rope thrown across a river that still ran fast under it. She told him it was nothing, which was untrue, and he told her it was everything, which was also untrue, because truth was somewhere between the two like a bridge no one owns. What do we owe the people who interrupt our worst selves long enough to let our better selves show up? They exchanged numbers, not as a promise, but as a hinge, the kind that lets a door remember both open and closed. Outside, the day smelled of rain on transformer oil, a quiet reminder that the world runs on currents most of us never see. On screen, Boundary. The video surfaced by afternoon. Of course it did, clipped and captioned, a neat parable with her cast as a caricature and him as a reluctant hero until the cut where the arc flashed and the story broke open. He watched the comments bloom like algae and felt the old reflex to let them grow, to accept the algorithm's absolution as if applause could clean a wound. Instead, he posted the piece they did, the audio recounting, the frame where her sleeve meets the melt, the quiet competence that unfurls when drama has used up all its oxygen. On screen, narrative. He wrote that he was wrong about her and right about the rules, and that those two truths do not cancel but complicate, and that complication is not weakness. It is adult. She watched from a city bus between shifts and felt a strange relief, not because the internet would love her, but because the story would not leave her behind as a lesson she did not choose. Is a redemption just a correction applied gently and repeated until it holds? The mall replaced the damaged connector and posted clearer guidance, and someone added a simple line that felt like a benediction. If you see smoke, stop the show. He returned a week later with a handwritten note taped near the charger, an apology not to her alone but to the commons, a promise to treat waiting like part of the journey instead of the theft of time. On screen, repair. She met him there by coincidence or gravity. He wasn't sure which, and for a moment they stood like bookends holding up a story neither would have shelled by choice. They spoke like neighbors do, brief, sincere, no ornate guilt, no performative grace. Two people aligned by an event that had burned off the varnish. He asked about her partner, and she nodded toward her horizon made of sirens and small victories, and he understood that some lives are built in rooms where endings are negotiated rather than declared. On screen, truth. He told her he had started carrying a spare cable and a spare patience, and she smiled at the second more than the first. They laughed about fate as if it were a clumsy stagehand who drops props to get attention, and the laugh landed in the space where anger used to live. What happens to a Karen when we return her first name? And what happens to a man when he stops auditioning for approval and learns to wait? Labels are bright shortcuts down dark hallways, but sometimes you need to turn on a light and walk the long way. On screen, illusion. The teenager who filmed a message later to say he had deleted the first upload and posted the whole thing, and no one applauded, which felt like progress anyway. Security waved when they passed, chastened by their own lateness, and the sign about courtesy stopped being scenery and started being a mirror. He charged a full that day and unplugged with a care that looked ceremonial, a small bow to the physics that had spared him and the person who had known how to help. She touched the new connected the way you touch a sleeping animal, respecting both its power and its peace, and then turned to go because mercy does not loiter. On screen, mercy. He watched her leave and felt the last of his defensiveness loosen, like a knot learning how to be string again. Maybe growth is just voltage finding a safer path. Current choosing patience over fire, a circuit redesigned by what nearly broke it. He drove away under a sky threaded with wires and wondered how many stories hang there, humming, waiting for us to listen before they spark. And if you ask him now what happened that night, he tells it this way. Two strangers met at the edge of a boundary, touched the wire of their assumptions, and decided to repair the line instead of cutting it. Because in the end, the real charge wasn't in the battery but in the choice, and the shock that sent him to a hospital became the reason he finally learned how to be grounded.